Hello, everybody, and welcome to Bright Founders Talk at TEMI. TEMI is an international software development company that designs, builds, and delivers software for sustainable businesses and promising startups. Welcome to our podcast, where we bring you the most inspiring stories of entrepreneurs and experts in the software development industry. Now, each week, we interview successful leaders who share their unique journeys and valuable insights. I'm your host, Barry, and today we're lucky enough to be joined by a remarkable guest, Thomas Knox, who is founder and CEO at VitVio. Hello, Thomas. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Barry. It's a pleasure to be here. Looking forward to this.
Yeah, me too. We really appreciate you taking time today to speak to us. Just to start off with, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and the company that you work at?
Yeah. Maybe I'll start off with myself, and because I think it sets some really good context as to what we're doing at VitVio. So Thomas Knox, founder, CEO of VitVio. Over the last decade or so, I've had the pleasure of helping build quite a few hypergrowth startups that have kind of gone from that 0 to billion mark or very quickly approaching it. Some people listening might actually be aware of some of them. For example, have you ever heard of Kiwi.com, the online travel company similar to Skyscanner, Kayak, one of these? It actually was ranked #1 this year by Forbes. Joined that in the super early days, literally 10 people working out of the CEO's converted apartment. And then over the next 3.5 years, we scaled it up from 10 people to 3,000 people. We went from doing like $250,000 to $1 billion a year. It was definitely a wild ride. And I was the head of innovations for all three years I was there. Did a couple of things in between, but most relevant to what we're going to be talking about today with VitVio is I was also head of product and part of the executive board for a company called iFi, which I guarantee nobody here has heard of, but they probably are aware of what we do. If you've ever heard of like Amazon Go or Amazon Fresh, that kind of style of autonomous stores where you can just like walk in, take whatever you want, walk out, no cashier. So iFi is the #1 competitor to Amazon in that space. So joined that before we even had a single store. Literally, I know this is going to sound super cliche, but I was working out of the CEO's apartment or CEO's garage in Silicon Valley. He had these like exotic birds that were sitting next to us. It was really funny. So you just hear peacocks going all day. But then, over the next 3.5 years there, we actually scaled it up to surpass Amazon in the number of autonomous stores. So iFi is actually the world's largest autonomous store vendor to date. The reason people don't really hear about it, though, is we were doing something clever here where we were white labeling it and then selling it to the big retailers like Aldi, Carrefour, Dollar General, United States, so on and so forth. They get to brag about their awesome technology, but in reality, we were doing all the hard bits behind it. It was a fantastic ride, and it was a lot of fun, and I learned a lot along the way of helping those companies grow. But there was always this feeling that wasn't as meaningful as I wanted to be. I felt like, there's always this, I had a very personal thing that occurred 2 years ago or so, a little bit over 2 years ago. My father passed away, and it gave me this moment of, let's say, reflection on saying, if I were to pass away today, would I be proud of the things that I did? And that felt like I made a material impact. And that really, pressured me to say, okay, with the knowledge and experience that I have, how could I bring this over into a place that, could actually help people, such as healthcare? So I started looking deeply into healthcare, and this is where VitVio was spawned. So what we do at VitVio is we are essentially an AI computer vision company for surgical, driving surgical efficiency. So essentially what we do is we go into surgical operating theaters, we deploy some cameras and sensors around the OR, and we start tracking all the people, equipment, fixtures, fittings, processes, you name it. At the intersection of a lot of that information, you're able to find really interesting context and insights to drive efficiency as well as improve safety and improve continuous learning aspects. So for example, when you're getting to the last 20 minutes of a surgery, we'll ping off to the preoperative nursing staff automatically to start prepping the next patient, or ping off to the cleaning crew to come to the OR. The whole idea here is to just kind of move away from this idea of manual data input, because I don't know if you've ever heard, there's a very famous quote or something where they're saying study where it's for every 1 hour with the patient, you spend 2 hours in your EHR. So what we're really trying to do is move away from that and get back to a place where the systems are working for the hospital staff, not the other way around.
So it's really interesting. It's a really exciting area to be developing in. So can you just tell me, how do you actually go about tracking and analyzing surgical procedures?
Yeah, so everything is computer vision based. So it's computer vision or machine learning for historical trends. It's a mixture of different things, but deep learning all around. But essentially what on the simplest level is, like I said, so you kind of go in, you deploy these cameras, and you can imagine those cameras are just looking consistently all the time as if you were a human standing there watching it. And they're looking for insights, for little context markers. So what we start to do is running that, we start basically converting the people who enter into a 3D skeleton and understand their context within the room and what actions they're taking. And that gives you a lot of insights, not just for driving the efficiency, but, going deeper into safety insights and so on. But really right now we focus a lot on the efficiency aspects because every hospital on the planet is having trouble keeping up. And with like aging populations, rising costs, lack of medical staff, like hospitals are really struggling to stay afloat. So efficiency is the name of the game to increase that throughput. And if you look at the UK, I mean, there's a backlog of nearly 8 million people waiting for surgery in a country of 60 million people. That's crazy. So the efficiency is the name of the game. But yeah, essentially what you're doing is just, putting those cameras in, starting to track, running the computer vision models over that, converting them into like a 3D, spatial context of understanding what's happening there. And then in that spatial context, in that 3D tracking, looking for context to understand, like, when did the patient arrive? When was knife to skin? When was skin, like wound closure events? And using that to help remove a lot of that manual data. But because like right now, they do log these things, but what they do is they will go into an EHR and write it down very manually into the like EHR. And to be honest, if you speak to a lot of these teams, it's a very much an estimation rather than the actual fact, because it's a high pressure environment with a lot of things to do. And your surgical staff, like logging information in the EHR is a second thought. But the problem is that information has a lot of, let's say, valuable input to be able to drive things efficiently. So we're trying to help them out there.
So that's really interesting. There's a lot of things going on in the surgical room, isn't there?
Yes.
How do you track all the movements and all the actions in the room? What is the biggest challenge in doing that?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest, let's say, first up is how do we do it? So essentially it's like, as you can imagine, essentially you come in and the cameras start detecting you. And because we've got multi-camera deployments, so you're talking like 5 to 10 of these cameras into the ceiling, maybe a weight sensor underneath one of the trays, and you're converting that into like a 3D skeleton, because you can imagine it. So it's essentially like if you walked in, you get converted into like a video game character where you can see like where each of your joints are in 3D space, and we're estimating those down, like triangulating them between the cameras down to like centimeter precision. Now, once you have that, I can start to understand and like figure out, what are you doing? Like where are you going? How, like, why are you touching certain things? What's your role in the team? And that's how we kind of garner this this context of the actions being taken. But then what you start to look for is like, for example, repeatable events, things that are like very easy to understand. As if you were watching the camera, would you be able to understand it? Or if you had the surgical training, of course, if you had the surgical training and you're watching these cameras, would you be able to understand it? Like, for example, a patient arriving to the room. That's a very interesting context because okay, from this point, here's how long it's going to take until they leave the room. So even that's that simple piece, right? Like you see the bed roll in, that's a good detection of like the person is now in the room. You see the anesthetics machine moving over and the anesthesiologist touching skin, anesthetic start time is occurring at this point. You see, surgeon is holding scalpel and they bring scalpel to skin. It's knife to skin. So there's these kind of like logical context that you understand when you speak with these teams and you really try to understand how do they judge it. If I was a nurse or a scrub tech, what would I do? When I'm staying there and I need to go log into the HR, like what is the knife to skin time or when did the patient arrive? That's kind of what we're trying to like take their thinking and then convert that into a system of detection so that it's repeatable, that you're having this like standardized like detection every single time that it occurs. So that's the first piece. The challenges, there's a ton of them, but I would maybe start with a couple. First one is on the technical side. This is not something like easy to do. It's a very hard, from a technical challenge perspective, we're pushing the limits of computer vision and AI in general. So it's a very difficult challenge on that point. From like a deployment perspective, there's also challenges. So you have to think about occlusions, right? Like there's a fact that when you have like 5 to 10, let's say 5 people in the room, 6 people in the room, part of your surgical team, they're always blocking your views at some point. So you need to try to have multiple views of a single area. And if you have those occlusions, what happens if you miss a detection? So there's a lot of things like that on the technical side that we have got challenges with. But I think the biggest challenge is the job that these clinicians and these like surgical staff have is very challenging and it is very complex. And there's a lot of things that they don't necessarily have written down as a process because somebody's been doing this for 25 years and they're just following through with what they know is most efficient. And I think it's trying to capture their knowledge and their processes in a really simple way to start detecting and starting to alleviate them of some of that manual effort that they're having to do. The process problem, like the process challenges they have are really, it's a difficult thing to learn. So we have to spend a lot of time with these teams. We're like literally every day interviewing surgeons and nurses and, the surgical staff on a whole to really ingrain that into the process. And every single step, essentially what we have to do is create this like giant process map that just goes through of every single step they have to do and then convert that into like detections of each of those stages. You know what I mean? So it's a lot. It takes a long time.
So you mentioned there that you do a lot of interviews with the nurses and the staff. Like, what kind of feedback do you get from stakeholders? Are there things there that you thought, actually, I never thought of that? Or are there things that are very predictable and you know that there's going to be these issues?
On a large scale, one of the things that we have going for us is we chose operating theaters because it's a known challenge. It's a known, you know what I mean? It's like everybody knows about the challenge of ORs. 40% of a hospital's expenses goes through the ORs. If you're looking in the United States, like 60 to 70% of their net profit comes from operating theaters as well. So it's a really, really big area of focus for them. What we're coming to here is not something new that like nobody's ever thought about. Oh, the OR is not as efficient as it could be. So there's a lot of, we're standing, I would like to say, maybe the best way to say this is we're standing on the shoulders of titans in this way of like, there is a ton of research, like peer reviewed research from really reputable universities and so on that we can actually, depend on. So that's why we do a lot with theirs, like bringing the knowledge of that in and trying to replicate what they've already done, but now brought into like automated fashion. So that's one piece I just want to start with. So when we go into the operating theater, we start to talk to these different members of staff or interviewing them and so on. There's not a lot of like, oh, completely unexpected, like, this is, we've misjudged the direction here. A lot of them are like, we want this. It's just, how can we get it? Because, it's a difficult challenge. One of the things that we have to work with, and I think this was one of the ones that we had to learn early on that was, I'm not saying that we were going this direction, but it was just something that we keep as like an ethos of the company, is I was talking to like a head of surgery at one hospital, and he said, hey, this sounds fantastic, but I just want to remind you of something. If you add an additional step to the surgeon or to the surgical team, you're going to end up on the surgical table. So the whole point is you always have to think about like, how do you either transition a current step that they're doing into something easier or remove it completely? Never try to add something to them because they just simply don't have the time or headspace to do so, especially in such a high pressure environment.
It's really interesting that you say that. And I think one of the natural things that's going to be impacting you in the future is AI. So it's going to be that question. So what is AI going to help with in the future in terms of your company?
I mean, AI is like, it's the core of our company. We are an AI company from the get-go. So it's like, it's deeply ingrained at every single step. I think the question is more of AI these days is almost too generalized. It's just this catch-all term for like everything that could potentially be like where it's making a prediction, and that's not necessarily the case. And I don't think all AI is made equal. And I also don't think all AI will be accepted as equal at the same pace. So for example, I'm just going to call out like, if you're talking about like clinical decision making. Clinical decision making is something that is very personal, that like very personal to the surgeons, to the clinical staff. It's something where calling out, like looking at, did they perform it the right way, or is there like a potential better diagnosis? That's a very difficult thing to automate, because then who has the liability and who makes the decision? Is the system better? And what happens if it misses something? I mean, there's a lot of questions here that will go on it that are unanswered at the moment, and will take a very long time for us to sort out and get used to. The way that I like to think about it is I think it's going to kind of go into like 3 stages almost. I think the first stage is, let's say, focusing on the operations rather than clinical. So focus on operations, like as what we're doing. And there's a very clear reason why we focused on operations on the efficiency. There's so much we can do on the like clinical aspects, clinical safety, decision making. There's a lot we can do when you have that context of like the 3D tracking and so on. But it's not something where I think we're ready for it just yet. I think the first piece is start with the operations, because it's something that no clinician or staff on the planet went into the medical industry to log into EHRs. Nobody wants to do that. Nobody likes logging this information. So if we can make their job easier and get them used to using these systems, that's like, I think, the very first step that we need to do. And that's where we're at. Now, I think the next step will be augmentation, where it's, if you see something, you call it out, and then the clinician uses that as like a judgment barrier. You know what I mean? So I'll give you an example from one of the things that we've already talked to hospitals about and we get a lot of questions on is, when you're doing surgery, post-surgery, they have to do a thing called the count, where they just like count to make sure they didn't leave anything inside the patient. We definitely would be able to help with that because we're detecting the tools, we're detecting which items have gone in and out. But the problem is that us making that, like helping with that today, is a very high risk. What if I miss something? What if I over-detect or under-detect, and that ends up causing them to be like too overly confident? You have to go through a lot of trials on this, and before you ever even think about putting it into real world. And even then, you need to be very careful. So I think the next step, though, will be that augmentation, where it's like, instead of me saying this happened, I'm going to call it out and make an alert to you just to think about it, like make you double check. If I think there might be a gauze missing or something, I'll just call out just because maybe you already knew it, but just in case you didn't, I want to give you that additional knowledge. then I think we'll finally start moving into the like clinical decision making and clinical like safety aspects. I think that's going to be a little bit further down the line, though. I'm not even sure that. I mean, we'll start to see some of it, especially with like LLMs and so on, coming deeply into the systems these days. But I really don't think you're going to see a huge uptick of it for at least the next like 5 years. I think maybe even a little bit longer than that before it's like mature. You're talking about a decade before it's actually in a mature place where like, you know, clinicians in general are feeling comfortable listening to like taking an AI system's word. You know what I mean? I think really that I think you're going to see this the early stage, this like stage one I was talking about with the efficiency and operations coming pretty quickly and being adopted massively very fast. I think that augmentation will probably be the next like 5 to 10 years where you start to move towards the decision making.
It's really interesting that you mentioned the liability and the risk. Is this risk limiting your imagination? Is it limiting what you want to do? And how do you find that sweet spot between being like not too risk averse, but being able to have that extra power, that extra imagination to do what you really want to do?
The best work that people do is when you have imagination within bounds. I think like if you know, I could sit here and dream of a world where like, you know, flying cars and robots and so on, but if you're not like bounding it to something that's within the realm of possibility, and that doesn't just mean technically, because of course there's things you can do technically in push fest, but it's also in the worlds of like the realm of acceptance and like moving the because we are humans, we work in a human environment. There's a big part of it of building trust. Right. And right now, there's not a lot of trust on that side, which it needs to be built up. Does it limit? I mean, yeah. I mean, as I was saying, there's things that I could do today where I could already go in and start helping with like clinical safety. But I know that that's not where we need to be focused right now. I know that's not like you need to build trust on the other aspects and then start moving into the clinical safety or moving into like the augmentation basically aspect of what I was saying before, like, but you can't just jump straight into it. So it does hold you back a little bit, but I think it's for the better. I mean, I think that it's very easy for, we've got very smart people working on these very hard challenges, but it's very easy to underestimate how hard of a challenge it is when you're not doing it every day. And a lot of times the reality is that the people who are building these technical solutions, like going in, like building AI, it takes a lifetime, a career to build a career or like to understand AI. So you can't really do the two in parallel, being a doctor and an AI expert at the same time. So what we're having to do is say, okay, we work together and we have to get the best of both worlds. But if you ignore the fact that this is like the clinician side is very challenging, it'd be easy for the AI engineers to run in feeling that they can do it better, but that's how people get hurt. And that's how you have this is how you like kill off a trust in an industry. So for me, I think it's way better that we take our time and take the pace of it as needed to work hand in hand with those clinicians to deliver it. You know what I mean?
And you mentioned building trust there. So in terms of generation, is there a generational trust issue when it comes to technology? Like younger people, I'm assuming, will be much more embracing of it, and older people are much more dubious about it. And if that's the case, how do you overcome that?
From my experience, I wouldn't say it's directly tied to like age. I think it's more directly tied to like the mindset of the person, which, you can correlate to age. But I would say that I've actually, some of my strongest supporters have been your white hair executives at a hospital. And they've been really like innovative, mind blowing. And they're the ones calling me excited about it. So like, what I would say is that there's been a shift of mindset massively. Like, so COVID was a really difficult time for everybody. No two ways about that. But there was like some, let's say, silver lining to the terrible situation is that the challenges that we got put under during COVID, especially the hospital systems, forced them to start thinking a different way. Because right now, like as I was talking about alluding to earlier, if that aging population, rising costs, lack of medical staff, backlogs of 8 million, and then you add to that COVID, it's like it was a most challenging point ever. Like, and not only that, a lot of people left the industry, and with that, what you start to see is a lot of the people who left the industry a lot of people who stayed in the industry either had a mindset change, or they just like moved into different positions and they decided that they don't want to be in those leadership positions anymore. And what we've been seeing really often is like all the hospitals we've been talking to, originally we thought there would be a lot more pushback on integrating like AI systems, and it's been almost the exact opposite. Like a lot of these hospitals now know the old ways didn't work, they don't work anymore, we need to adjust, we need to adopt these systems, because they simply can't go hire any more people. Like there's no additional pool of people to hire from, because a lot of people left the industry, and that takes a long time to rebuild that. So right now you're starting to see technological solutions coming in at a much faster pace than they previously were. So because like they just have to, like there's really no other option to keep up with it. I think that's really driven a massive mindset change. And that is sometimes because the younger generation came up, but sometimes it's the older generation that actually just flipped their mindset. They decided like, hey, you know, what I was doing worked for the last 50 years, but it's not working now, and we need to adjust. So it's been really nice to see, actually. It's been nice to see.
They say necessity is the mother of invention.
Exactly.
I think COVID is a kind of response to, as it's been the cause of some of that, hasn't it?
Yeah, and chaos breeds creation.
Yes, exactly. So you've got the unfortunate position of having to be like in the medical field, which is advancing like constantly, and also the technology field is advancing constantly. Like, how do you keep up to date with all of that? Is it possible? Are you always chasing your tail, kind of?
Oh yeah, I mean, you're always gonna be chasing tail, but I think that that's always like that's the best place to be. I mean, I'm a massive nerd that loves to read like scientific papers. So actually, I would say our entire team is like we even have like a system, not even a joke. Internally, we have like a tool that's like an AI system for like annotating papers. We go in, we annotate, like we'll take papers each, annotate them, and then it creates an LLM of the different papers, so you can kind of ask it questions and find where it was. It's really super nerdy, but I love it. So we try to keep up on these things as much as I can. I think that it's like having that mindset of always be learning is the best possible thing you can do. The one thing I would say is like where that's the hardest thing to keep up on is not necessarily on the always changing medical field, because you can keep up. There's a lot of like scientific papers that come out. You can keep up to date on those. Hospitals usually take a couple years for them to adopt those anyway. So you do have a bit of time. And usually if you're working with those hospitals hand in hand as we are, you're hearing those updates far before they get implemented. So that's not as big of a challenge. I think the bigger challenge is how do you keep updated when you're having like different hospitals working in completely different ways, like different systems, different processes, different like certain standards for these things. I think that's a much harder challenge. And the day that I figure that out, Barry, I'll let you know, but I don't know the answer right now. Is we do our best, we work hand in hand with them and try to understand their challenges, like by just being a part of the team, essentially. You know what I mean? But that takes a lot of effort.
Lovely, great answer. Thank you for sharing it with me. Now we are slightly coming towards the end, unfortunately, and I could talk to you about this all day, but as an entrepreneur, as someone who's been building these companies and promote, what is the biggest challenge? So let's say there's someone out there who's wanting to be an entrepreneur. What advice would you give them? What is the most important thing that they can consider before they step into the world of entrepreneurship?
Yeah, I would say you've got to have grit. There is some very scary and hard times when you're first going in, especially in the really early days. Basically, you have to embrace the suck, as I would say. Like I always use this term of like realistic optimism. You need to be realistic that, you know, the things that you're doing might not work out and you might have you're going to come into hurdles, but stay optimistic on the direction that you're going and like keep yourself motivated, because there's nobody else that's going to do that. And sometimes you're pushing against the grain, you know what I mean? Like sometimes you've got people telling you in every year, like, hey, this isn't I'm not sure it's about it. And yeah, you need to take that in. But if you're really convicted about it and you have a reason for being convicted, and I want to highlight, you have to have a reason for it. Don't just be like, oh, this is like because I wanted that way. Like, for example, with surgeries going in, I didn't know enough about it to have conviction. I had to learn that conviction by talking to them and not like leading my questions saying, tell me your problems. Like, just talk to me about your problems. And then after I hear enough people tell me their problems, you start to draw the lines, like connect the dots between the different problems, and you build out a product. But once I had that, I was very convicted and started to drive it forwards. And you're talking to sometimes, I mean, like in the early days, like when we were first raising, we've raised now, we're fully funded and everything. But when we were raising, some of the VCs were questioning. They're like, you know, is this, our surgeons going to be okay with like having cameras in there, blah, blah, blah. And it wasn't a problem at all. And finally we found VCs that were like supporting us, and then things just like took off. Like it took off like crazy. And now I'm talking to like 9 of the top 15 US hospitals. We're already going into NHS hospitals. Like I've got 3 or 4 contracts I'm sending out to hospitals this week as well. So it's like things are going very, very fast, but that was like some people who don't necessarily understand those challenges, since they don't feel it every day, you know, they don't necessarily understand that. So you have to stay like realistically optimistic and have some grit and focus down on it. And also I would really, really, really double down on your first hires, the people that you bring on. And I don't mean just your hires, but also your co-founders. Don't make a mistake on that early, because if you make a mistake on that early, it's really hard to correct. I would say focus on getting the right team next to you, that you, when you're going into this, you feel like you're on a team together, rushing in, not that you're like dragging people along. Because in a startup in the early days, it's impossible. You won't make it. You'll drown in the amount of work and effort that has to go in that. And I'm very blessed that I have some amazing co-founders. So shout out to Alex, Max, Peter. You guys are amazing. That like every step of the way, I feel like I can focus on my goals, on like getting the hospitals in the door, getting our fundraise. Well, I know that our CTO, I don't have to be double checking his work and worried is he actually pulling it, because I know he wants it just as much as I am, and so does every person on the team. So it feels good when you have that built through the line.
Nuggets of gold there. Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Tom. Just want to thank you again for taking time to speak with us today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure, Barry. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was Thomas Knox, founder and CEO at VitVio.